Welcome to another episode of Cadence Fishing TV, and I'm fishing on the wonderful River Wye here in Hereford. It's the middle of December and the weather's surprisingly mild. It's unbelievable really. A couple of weeks ago we had a fair bit of snow and ice. There's been a lot of rain and the river last week was really high, over the banks in fact, so definitely over sort of 15 foot in height. It's gradually dropped down over the last week, and today there's a bit over 4 foot on the river and it's starting to look really beautiful. It is an amazing river, the Wye, considering the range in levels that we fish in. And as the river's dropping today, this peg will probably slightly change as the river drops. I'm guessing it's probably going to drop about 8 or 10 inches today. The fact that the weather's so mild is a big advantage because the fish will spread out. When the river drops lower here in Hereford in the middle of the winter, this period, a lot of the time the shoals of fish will really congregate down in the town. And I've decided to fish a bit of a different stretch today, and this stretch called the Ash Path, and it's sort of in the middle of the Hereford stretch here on Belmont. I match fish a lot on here and pleasure fish, and I love the variety in the different pegs in the areas. If it was really cold, I probably wouldn't have fished here, but I'm confident that we should catch a few fish today, and I'm going to target hopefully some nice roach and perch and some dace, and I'm really just sort of looking forward to enjoying the day. I do so much match fishing on here, which can be quite intense, you know, team fishing, so all the time you're fighting for your teammates, trying to catch as much as you can. I've had some big bleak weights this year, up to 48 pound, and the fishing has been phenomenal, but I'm just looking forward to really enjoying myself today and taking it easy. So the actual peg I've selected today is peg 48, which is just upstream of the old railway bridge, and you park at the Rugby Club car park. I love this stretch of river here because I have caught some wonderful big roach here in the past. But the first thing I'm going to do is plumb up. Now I know from experience quite a lot about the peg in this area, and it's quite typical of much of Belmont really, in that you've got a really defined channel in the river. So there's a steep ledge, and then it's pretty much a flat channel, and then you've got a steep ledge up on the far bank. So when you're fishing, as always on any kind of river venue, it pays to take your time and plumb up very carefully. So I'm going to plumb up to start with. I'm using this 7.5 metre pole. And what I'm trying to do is just work out where that ledge is. And what I will always do as well is have a feel about to see if there's any snags. So you can actually see there that from perhaps 6-7 metres out, I'm just a little bit over depth there, about a float's depth over depth. If I move it in so that I'm just probably 4 metres out from the bank, I've got pretty much the same depth. And then if I come any closer, I'm going to start to hit that ledge, and I can feel it now, look. So it's really coming up sharply. Now that's a really key feature. And a lot of the time when you're fishing up Belmont, you're catching the fish at the bottom of that ledge. The fish really seem to like hugging the bottom of that ledge, especially the big roach and the perch. So if the river was lower and the water was clearer, that's when you'll have to start fishing further out into the flow. But as you can see today, with 4 foot plus of water on, the flow is really still quite powerful. And fishing that out with a float today would be possible, but one, I don't think it's going to be as productive as fishing closer into the bank, and two, it's going to make the job a lot more difficult. If I was fishing further upstream, from peg 2 to perhaps peg 24, I'd be starting on a feeder today. But I'm quite confident that I should catch some fish on a float, and I'm going to concentrate my tactics fishing close into that ledge. So I've set 3 whips up today, 2 at 7.5 meters, one with a flat float, one with a standard traditional tight float, and I've also set up a short one at 5 meters with a flat float. I'm thinking I might catch some nice perch close in on chop worm, and to start with I'm going to fish the whip at 7.5 meters. I'm going to introduce a bit of ground bait and bait dropper some bait in, and then I'm going to start loose feeding. So my main tactics for today are to catch on the pole on the whip, and then on the stick float further down my peg. You'll notice another great advantage of this peg is the cover that I've got downstream. We've got trees in the water and overhanging trees, and that's going to be great cover for hopefully the better roach that we might encounter today. But you just never know with the Wye. It's such an exciting river. As I mentioned, catches this year have just been absolutely phenomenal, so let's just hope we get a little taste of that today. So I'm going to start off just introducing a bit of ground bait. I'll talk about the ground bait mix in a bit more detail. And all I'm going to do is add some nice hemp with all the hemp oil in, and a handful of casters. And I'm just going to make quite a rich mix there. I'm just going to put 3 balls of ground bait in on that whip line. So I'll just make them up and I'll show you. I'm not going to go mad because I'm pleasure fishing today. I've got the whole bank to myself, and plus the fact I want to conserve my bait. You know, if you start off and put a lot of bait in, it kind of eats into the feed that you can feed later in the day. So mixed up 3 nice balls of ground bait there, you can see. About the size of a small orange. And just going to swing my rig into place. And I'm going to throw those balls in. I'm going to throw them slightly downstream so I can run onto them. If I put them too far in front of me, it's going to be hard to present my bait over the top. And I don't want to put them too far down the swim because obviously that will push the fish further out of the pole range, but that should be about right. And what I like to do as well is just to get another bit of hitter bait in to attract the fish is I'm going to put in a couple of bait droppers of maggots. I'm just going to swing them into position. So you'll notice I'm not really using the maximum length of my whip. It's kind of goes against how I like to fish the pole on the river normally, but it's just helping me to fish in the most efficient way on this swim with the nature of that swim with the ledge, so I can get my float and present it perfectly into that, hopefully the catching zone. So there we go. I've put 2 big bait droppers of maggots in. Not going to feed anything else to start with. I'm just going to start with 2 maggots. I think I'll go a white and a red. I'm fishing with a 14 hook, so I'm fishing quite a big hook. And let's just see how that works. I did have a few runs through with my float before I started feeding. That's a 4 gram float, and I've slightly overshotted it. And I've probably got about, I suppose, about a 2 metre run there. I can always put my bait in upstream as well, so that I can get the bait down and then run it over the feed. What I'm going to start doing is loose feeding, but loose feeding very tight to the bank. And that hopefully helps draw some fish up from downstream, and also become really useful when I'm fishing the stick float further down the peg. There we are, that's a small dace to start with, so we're off the mark. In cold conditions, it's very often the dace that are the fish that feed, and they're the fish that you often catch first. I'm not going to go mad with the feed to start with. I'm not going to feed too much. I'm just going to feel my way in and just see how the fish respond. That was another bite there.
Can I just explain why and what the advantages of using it? Not necessarily.
Yeah. So there we go. Quite quickly, that's another fish. I'm not sure if it's a better dace or a roach. It's a better dace. Might just have to adjust my rig slightly just to shorten it a little bit, but the main reason for using a whip or a pole like this is just simply efficiency. So we know we're going to catch a good amount of fish, and if I can concentrate the fish within pole range, within this whip range, then that's going to be the most efficient way to catch them. And it's also a great way of presenting your bait. So I can control it really perfectly over that quite short area. So on days when maybe the fish aren't feeding quite as prolifically and you've got to work at the fish, that's when trotting a float with a rod and line will beat a pole. And obviously, you know, when you're fishing like this and pleasure fishing, you're just enjoying yourself, so you can really fish however you want. But I like fishing a pole to hand like this. It's great fun and means that you can build a weight very easily and quickly. But I'm also looking forward to having a go on the stick float today and enjoying that. So you can see I'm just gently lowering my rig into position just above where I've been feeding. Then I'm running my float over the top of that ground bait and the maggots that I bait dropped. Just holding the float, easing it through over the top and looking for a bite. And sometimes like that you're actually getting a lift on the float. So what's happening is the shot that I'm using, which is quite a positive shotting pattern, I'll show you that a bit later. Not sure, this might be a roach. Really means you can spot the bite, so I'm definitely going to have to shorten my rig down a bit. Let's get this fish in. Looks like a puppy chub actually, not a roach. There we go. And the river this year has been absolutely stuffed with these chub. They're the most amazing fish. I mean, that's knocking a pound. And my best weight this year of them's been 60 pound in a match. I caught those on bread that day. But the phenomenal amount of these chub in the river at the moment. And the great thing is that, especially when the river's up like this, they are spread out. Well, that's great. It just shows you I was confident that there'd be some fish on these pegs, but I didn't think I'd be into them this quickly. Just making use of the beautiful mild conditions. So I think I'll have one more run down and then I'll probably put another ball of ground bait in on that pole line. It is important to keep feeding. It's such a big, powerful river with so many fish. So I'm just going to put a hand-sized ball of ground bait in and I'm going to feed that exactly in the right spot so I can present my float right over the top of it. A lot of the times you feed a ball of ground bait like that and you'll pretty much get a bite straight away, so the fish are obviously moving in on the feed. Did have a bite, but I missed it. That's been a nice steady start on the whip at 7 metres. I'm just putting another bait dropper in of maggots and some hemp, and my thinking is I'll just keep sort of catching on this line whilst I'm feeding the stick float line, hopefully building that up for some better quality roach later in the session. It's always good to feed two lines anyway, just so hopefully we can catch on both and swap between them, and in a bit I'll put a bit of chop worm down the side and see if we can catch a nice perch. The stamp of the dace this year has been really good as well. I mean, some of them, they're unreal, they're like 2 or 3 to the pound. So when we're match fishing, that's absolutely fantastic, because if you can sort out the stamp fish, that's when you can build a really great weight. But it's also fantastic when you're pleasure fishing like this and just enjoying yourself. Yeah, I think pleasure fishing in the winter on rivers can be a bit challenging, but when conditions are right like this, you can get some absolutely fantastic sport, and so much so on the River Wye. You do have to get it right, you know, often the river's too high, it's in flood, or whenever we get the really cold water conditions from the snowmelt, that can make the fishing more challenging. But for me, I don't think there's anything better than having a day's fishing on a river like this, and what fantastic sport. It's always good to speak to the locals, and yesterday I spoke to Woody in the local tackle shop, and Woody told me that there was a good amount of people fishing, everybody was catching, and that obviously gave us the confidence to come and fish. But I'd always recommend calling in to see Woody, buying a bit of bait and tackle, and Woody will put you on the fish. He's just so knowledgeable about the Venule and the River Wye in this area. So I think I'll catch a couple more fish on this whip, and I'm going to put a bit of bait in on the close-in chop worm line and just see if there's any nice perch about, because they can be absolutely spectacular. There's another chub on the 7 metre pole. I'll just put him in the net, and then we'll talk about the rig that we're using. So I'm fishing the CP 200 pole at 7.5 metres, The float I'm using, it's a 4 gram desk float. Don't know if you can see that. It's got a sort of inverted rugby ball shape with a carbon stem and a good hollow tip. So that's the type of float I favour when I'm fishing a whip on the Wye, but there's still some pace, so I need a bit of control. If the river was a bit slower, I'd favour a more slimmer style float, but that float will let me get some good control and slow the float down and the bait down and present the bait perfectly. It's a positive rig, so I've got my Olivet at the moment about, I don't know, 2 foot from the hook length. I'll adjust that depending on how the fish are responding. And I talked about a positive dropper, so I've got 3 number 4 droppers there, just positioned above a short hook length, about a 5 or 6 inch hook length. Main line I'm using is 019, so it's a robust line, strong enough for this kind of fishing where you're putting a lot of strain on the tackle by catching lots of fish. And the hook length I'm using is 013, and I've got a size 14 carbon match on at the moment. Best bait seems to be just 2 or 3 maggots. I mentioned that I'd overshotted the float, and that's a real key fact to mention. So I've overshotted the float by just about 3 number 4 shot, and I've put those below the Olivet, and that's just enabling me to just hang on and control the float through the peg. I'm fishing really on the edge of the main flow, so I'm on the crease, and as I mentioned, I'm trying to get my bait at the bottom of the ledge. So the crease is always a great area for the fish to hang because they're not having to work hard out in the main flow, and they're just on the edge of the crease in the flow. That's where I want to put my float and present it in the best way possible. So overshotting the float on a day like this really enables me to do that. I'm using a 10 to 12 hollow elastic at the moment, just through a short length of the tip, and that's giving me enough give as a shock absorber when I'm hooking the fish and enabling me to be able to swing them in to hand efficiently and quickly. I'm going to spread that double bulk out now, just try that for a little bit. If I was getting pestered by small fish like bleak, I'd move that bulk down and sometimes not even have a dropper, have the bulk right down by the hook length, just to try and get through the small fish down to the better fish, but we're not getting that problem today, so I'm just going to try and just change my shotting pattern a little bit, and just a few tweaks like that can make all the difference. And I'm surprised, that's another one of those chub. There's definitely some chub feeding in the peg. I was going to feed the chop worm and have a go for some perch, but I think whilst I'm catching these chub, I'll keep doing it. So feed wise, I'm just topping up with a ball of ground bait with plenty of feed in it every sort of 4 or 5 runs through, and then I'm bait dropping as well every so often. I mean, you simply couldn't feed enough bait on the river when conditions are like this, but you've also got to be conscious that you've got to kind of ration it a bit. It's a little bit like ammunition. You can't feed it all because I've got to make it last for the whole session, and I haven't brought a load of bait with me today, so I'm treating it more like a pleasure session really. This feels like a good fish. Not sure if it's a big perch or another one of those chub. Might be a big perch, I think. It's kicking like a perch anyway. Yeah, it is a perch. Nice one. Well, I haven't actually put any chopped worm in yet, but that gives me some heart that there might be some nice perch to catch when we go on the inside. It just shows you what I was on about the Wye at the moment. It's absolutely spectacular when you think that you're kind of getting a bit blasé about catching perch like this, and it's an absolute beauty. So I'll just gently unhook him and hold him up and show you. It's definitely got Monty's attention, and he's got a bit of attitude as well. Well, an absolutely beautiful perch. Look at the markings on it. You can see the black stripes. He's a fierce character, he is. Right then, I think I've had a good run of fish on that 7-metre whip. I've had a couple of nice perch and some more of those smaller chub, a couple of roach. I just want to try right tight to the bank here with some chopped worm, and I'm going to bait dropper again. Bait dropping when you're fishing in a river like this is so effective because you obviously get the bait right down to where you're going to be presenting your bait. If I was loose feeding, you know, that would be spread out down the peg and be difficult to concentrate the fish in one spot. So I've chopped up some worms. I've mixed it with some casters. Not sure if Chappy can see that. And I'm going to give it a good bait dropper of that. Right tight to the bank down here. It's amazing how close you can catch these big perch and roach when you've got a peg like this where you've got such good depth close to the bank. So normally when I put some chopped worm in like that, I do like to go on it straight away. So let's give it a go. And I'm not fed it yet, and sometimes you have to feed it a few times, but I'm going to give it a go straight away with, I think I'm going to go with 2 halves of a worm. And it's a positive method. I've got a size 10 hook. Just going to tip it over with a caster just to stop the worm from bending over the point, but there's the bait. And I'm fishing that on a 6-gram flat float. Let's just see if we can catch anything. Sometimes takes a bit of adjusting to get the float to work properly, but flat floats can be so effective when you're trying to hold a bait in position like this. You're going to definitely need to put a shot on that, so just to overshot it slightly. If I wanted to lay on and fish like this with a conventional float, I'd have to use a much heavier float. That's the advantage of using a flat float in this situation. That's something like right. The peg's a bit boily at the moment, and that's another factor. I'm not going to stop. I'm going to keep feeding my whip line with balls of ground bait, and I've started feeding casters now close in. It's a view for fishing the stick float and caster further down my peg later on in the session. You've got to be careful loose feeding on the Wye because of the amount of bleak that you can attract into your peg. So on the longer line at that 7 metre whip, I'm just feeding with ground bait and bait dropping. I'm not loose feeding at all. And on the inside I am risking feeding casters really close to the bank now. And if I started getting problems with bleak, then I'd cut that out completely, but I think that's going to be the best way to hopefully catch some better roach later on in the session, a little bit further down the peg. But let's just see if we can catch anything close in. You can see that flat float's about perfect now, it's settling nicely, and as always with the worm, it's good to move it about a bit and try and tempt a perch to grab it. Must have a good 6 or 7 foot just right off the bank there. You can just imagine fish like big roach and perch just hanging out there. You can see the flow and the turbulence is just moving the float around a little bit, so I might fish a little bit more over depth yet. Well, the quick go on the inside and not a bite surprisingly, so I'm going to keep feeding it, but I'm going to go back out and feed my whip line. I just thought I'd explain a bit more about the bait dropper for those that aren't familiar with it. So this is quite a decent sized one. You'll see I've modified it. I've added a longer rod to it, basically add some weight to it, so I've got more weight on the bottom, which is really key when you're fishing a powerful river like the Wye. And my idea with that is it's going to get the bait right down near the bottom and deposit it over a quite tight area. So obviously I'll just swing it into position, just avoiding the tree above me. And that's down on the bottom now, it's released. Let all the bait out and I can just swing it in, and you'll see that the bait dropper is now open. So basically it's released all of its contents. So lower it down to the bottom and it lets all the bait out. Really key piece of kit when you're fishing powerful rivers like the Wye. Well, the whip line's quite prolific really for good sized dace now, and I'm pretty sure if I just kept fishing that for the rest of the session I'd put together a good bag of them. But I'm going to spend a bit of time on the stick float now. I've been loose feeding casters tight to the bank, and I just want to try giving this a good go for 20 minutes or half an hour just to see if I can get some of those beautiful roach feeding. It's always a bit of a dilemma in a match situation because obviously I've got the guaranteed dace on the whip that are going to build a good weight, but you know, if I could get amongst the big roach, then that's when you could go to an even higher weight. But perhaps most of the time you just swap in between the two, but I'm going to enjoy a bit of stick float fishing now and see if I can catch some nice roach or perch just tight to the bank. And there we go, that's one. I think that might be a perch. Yeah, it's a small perch. About 4 or 5 ounces. Beautiful little perch. And then I've just had 3 or 4 casts and just starting to understand and learn the peg. It's quite interesting. The main flow kind of hits me here. This is the full force of the flow. Even on the inside it's quite pacey. And as you go down the peg, there's a nice bit of a slack in that bay there. And that's where I'm going to target fishing this stick float. So I'm going to really fish tight to the bank. I'm using a 8 number 4 stick float. Perhaps this is a good time to talk about the rig. I'll just show you the float before I go back out. This is a Dave Howell 8 number 4 stick with an alloy stem. Absolutely brilliant for this type of fishing. You've got to have a float heavy enough that's going to enable you to get the bait down and control it in the pace of the river. And the wire stem really helps where you've got this turbulent flow. Just gives some stability to the float without affecting the float too much, so you can control the float nicely. And I suppose I better talk about the shotting pattern as well. I've started off fishing with a bulk. Nearly all my stick floats I just use number 8 shot, and you can see there I've got a good bulk of number 8s. There must be getting on for 20 number 8s there, and that's about 4 foot from my hook length, 3 or 4 foot from the hook length. And then I've just got 1, 2, 3 number 8s and then 3 number 10s below that, and a nice long hook length. And what I'm actually doing is I'm fishing about 8 inches over depth, and a little bit like I was doing on the whip really. Enables me to hold on to the float, lift it and drop it and try and tempt a bite. So feeding wise, for the last half hour I've just been feeding casters right tight to the bank, and my intention is to catch perhaps about, I don't know, 2 or 3 rod lengths below where I'm loose feeding in that nice bay under the cover of that tree. So my float at the moment is literally just 2 or 3 foot from the bank. Dome tops are good like this when you're fishing a little bit over depth, because a more sensitive float would keep getting dragged under. So this just gives me a little bit more buoyancy in the tip, but still enables me to be able to spot a bite. I'm using our CR10 15 foot number 2 rod, which the extra length really helps when you're fishing on rivers, especially the Wye. When you're fishing, you know, there's 4 or 5 foot of extra water on today, so my peg's still going to be 9, 10 foot deep, and having that bit extra length really helps. And the reel I'm using is our CS10 4000, and I've loaded that up with 017 mainline, which is around about £3. So I'm going to try even closer to the bank this time. The hook I'm using to start with is a 16 carbon match to an 012 hook length, and I'll play about with that. I mean, on a really good day, I mean, some of the roach weights this year have been phenomenal, approaching £100. So in those situations, obviously you've got to step the gear up, you know, accordingly to enable you to catch such a big weight. But I'm going to start off a bit finer. Not that that's really fine for most of my match fishing, but on the Wye, a 16 hook and 012 is considered quite fine. But I really want to try and see if I can catch some of those nice roach, so I'm prepared to fish with a little bit more finesse, and if I start hooking bigger fish, then obviously I can step up. Not a bad roach. That's the sort of stamp that I'm after, and hopefully a little bit bigger. Absolutely pristine, beautiful roach. Amazing fish, they're so solid and chunky. I know earlier on in the season when we were fishing some big matches like the festival and some of the other open matches, it was almost impossible to fish maggots like this or casters. You were having to fish bigger baits to get through the bleak. The bleak is unbelievable. They're throughout the length and they cause massive problems. Not obviously if you wanted to target them, but when you're trying to target other fish like these nice roach and dace. So a lot of anglers were using baits and different baits, and tares and corn was a fantastic bait. I know some of my friends that pleasure fish the stretch had some fantastic bags of roach, some of them over £2, using tares and corn. So that's something to bear in mind if you're getting pestered by small bleak. I've only had a couple today, so hopefully they'll stay away and we can catch them on the more traditional baits like castor and maggot. And I'm feeding casters just to try and see if that will attract the better roach, and it gives me an option of fishing castor hook baits or maggot. That roach I just had was on double red maggot. I've had a good run on the stick float, and last two chucks I've had two nice perch fishing the stick float right close in, and I just thought I'd try my chop worm rig in a similar area. I've tried that line close in here, and I've not had a bite on it, which surprises me. But it's almost like further down my peg it's a bit steadier, and the fact I've had those few perch down there, there we go. It's kind of proved the point. Just dropped a worm in down there, and I've had a perch straight away. So they've obviously found a spot where they're feeding on the casters that I'm loose feeding, and that's where they want to be. But I've had some nice roach on the stick, but I've probably had more perch. Look at that. So I was using a whole worm and fishing about a foot over depth. Well, I've been feeding mainly casters, bit of hemp in that sort of quantity, quite regular. And I've been throwing it down my peg right next to the bank. And you probably might be able to see now where I just caught that perch, just swinging my bait right down into that nice little slack. See if there's another one. Swirling around a bit down there. There we go. Oh, bumped that one, it was just a little one. So I think I'll try two halves of a worm tipped off with a maggot. Look, what perch could resist that? And I've got a nice depth down there, and you can see it's just a little bit steadier. You got lovely cover from the bank. Sometimes you get the big roach when you're fishing like this, even fishing fairly heavy gear for the perch. And I've also had some big chub, so it's a great method. So maybe just a small fish. Well, this shows the versatility of our CP200 whip. So I've got a telescopic top 5, which was the rig I was using just down here, and now I've gone to full 9 meters, so I can exploit that area down my peg. So not only can you fish the whips to hand in the normal way, they're quite good for fishing with a short line as well. In this situation, and also when you're fishing canals and drains, and you can benefit from the lovely slim profile and light whip, and also maybe, you know, if you can't afford a long pole, this whip actually fishes really well at 9 meters. Nice greedy little perch. I'll keep loose feeding that hempen caster, and I might even in the last part of the session. Put some chopped worm down there as well. I do fancy catching a good roach down there. I think that was a little fish again. I'll show you how I hook a worm. So when I'm chopped worm fishing, this is how I typically hook a worm. So I've got a good sized dendrobina and I just nip the head off. And then this is a size 10 hook, which should just enable me to thread the worm onto the hook. So I'm covering up the hook with the worm, and I've still got some hook protruding. And I always like to tip it off with a maggot or a caster, not really to add anything to the bait apart from the fact it can stop the worm from bending back over and hooking onto the point, which obviously means you can miss a bite or hook a fish and pull out. Our CP200 9-metre whip is now supplied with this really handy reversible extension. So it fits between the 7-metre section and the 9-metre section. I'll give it a go now, so I can just get that little bit further down my peg with the mini extension. I find it really useful. A great advantage of using it is when you want a bait dropper in and you're using a flick tip. So if you're using quite a heavy flick tip, you'll find that the whip will really bend with the weight of the bait dropper and it's hard to get it into position. But if you add this mini extension, it just gives you that bit better leverage and makes the job so easy. So I think it's a real advantage, and it's also great for days when you're maybe sitting on the pole as well, so you're not damaging the main section. And like I say, it's reversible, so you can fit it on the 9-metre section or the 7.5-metre section. Another good way to hook the worm when you're fishing like this is break the worm in half, then thread the head on, and then put the other half on next to it. Just going to nick the tail off that, and then I'm going to top that up with a red maggot. So basically got two halves of worm. It's interesting when you're fishing like this, you can often catch straight away on a whole worm and then you're perhaps not getting any bites. Try two halves like that, or just a head or two bits of a tail, and it'll often get you a few more fish. It's obviously the fish are there, but they don't want to eat a whole worm, or they've maybe been caught on a whole worm, so they've got to get used to eating the chopped worm. And obviously the chopped worm, there's lots of bits, so it's quite a good tip really when you're worm fishing to try little segments of worms as well. Yeah, definitely found a nest of those perch down there. When we're match fishing, it's often the last sort of hour, half an hour when you start to catch better fish. Oh, it's nice, it's a chub, look, a little chub. Obviously the light starts to fade this time of year really early, and sometimes that's when you'll catch your bonus fish, so it's always worth trying it towards the end of the match or towards the end of your pleasure session. You might be rewarded by some really nice bonus fish. Well, that's another lovely perch on the stick float. Just taken on double red maggot. So this short session, haven't caught the big roach I was really hoping for. I've had some nice roach and some beautiful dace, but I think the day's been topped by these fantastic perch. Another stunning River Wye perch. It's been really nice to just fish a relaxed session, and in contrast to all the matches that I'm normally fishing here at Hereford. And it's been great to catch those nice big perch and the odd roach on a stick float and on the pole. I think today you could have picked a variety of pegs from the top all the way through to the bottom and had a fantastic day sport. And that's worth remembering, that the fact that we're fishing in the middle of the winter, so don't discount river fishing in the winter, that's for sure. I want to thank Woody at the tackle shop in Hereford for all his help, and also for the Hereford Club for letting us to fish here today. So thanks ever so much to them, and thanks to you for watching. Don't forget to comment on the video and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. For more information, check out the links in our product description below and also on our website, cadencefishing.co.uk.